I think I should also add that as far as Senator Kennedy's proposals are concerned, if he intends to carry out his platform, the one adopted in Los Angeles, it is just impossible for him to make good on those promises without raising taxes or without having a rise in prices or both. The platform suggests that it can be done through economic growth, that it can be done in effect with mirrors, but it isn't going to be working that way. You can't add billions of dollars to our expenditures and not pay for it. After all, it isn't paid for by my money, it isn't paid for by his, but by the people's money.
Mr. Niven with a question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, you said that while Mr. Khrushchev is here, Senator Kennedy should talk about what's right with this country as well as what's wrong with the country. In the 1952 campaign, when you were a Republican candidate for Vice President, and we were at war with the communists, did you feel a similar responsibility to talk about what was right with the country?
I did, and as I have pointed out in 1952, I have made it very clear that as far as the Korean War was concerned, that I felt that the decision to go into the war in Korea was right and necessary. What I criticized were the policies that made it necessary to go to Korea. Now, incidentally, I should point out here that Senator Kennedy has attacked our foreign policy. He said that it's been a policy that has led to defeat and retreat. And I'd like to know, where have we been defeated and where have we retreated? In the Truman administration, 600 million people went behind the Iron Curtain, including the satellite countries of Eastern Europe and communist China. In this administration, we've stopped them at Quemoy and Matsu, we've stopped them in Indochina, we've stopped them in Lebanon, we've stopped them in other parts of the world. I would also like to point out that as far as Senator Kennedy's comments are concerned, I think he has a perfect right and a responsibility to criticize this administration whenever he thinks we're wrong. But he has a responsibility to be accurate and not to misstate the case. I don't think he should say that our prestige is an all-time low. I think this is very harmful at a time Mr. Khrushchev is here. Harmful because it's wrong. I don't think it was helpful when he suggested, and I'm glad he's corrected this to an extent, that 17 million people go to bed hungry every night in the United States. Now, this just wasn't true. Now, there are people who go to bed hungry in the United States. Far less, incidentally, than used to go to bed hungry when we came into power at the end of the Truman administration. But the thing that is right about the United States that should be emphasized is that less people go to bed hungry in the United States than in any major country in the world. We're the best fed, we're the best clothed, with a better distribution of this world's goods to all of our people than any people in history. Now, in pointing out the things that are wrong, I think we ought to emphasize America's strength. It isn't necessary to run America down in order to build her up. Now, just so we get it absolutely clear, Senator Kennedy must, as a candidate, as I as a candidate in 52, criticize us when we're wrong. And he's doing a very effective job of that in his way. But on the other hand, he has a responsibility to be accurate. And I have a responsibility to correct him every time he misstates the case. And I intend to continue to do so.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, Mr. Nixon, I'll just give you the testimony of Mr. George Aiken. Senator George Aiken, the ranking minority member, Republican member and former chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee, testifying in 1959, said there were 26 million Americans who did not have the income to afford a decent diet. Mr. Benson, testifying on the food stamp plan in 1957, said there were 25 million Americans who could not afford a elementary low-cost diet. And he defined that as someone who uses beans in place of meat. Now, I've seen a good many hundreds of thousands of people who are not adequately fed. You can't tell me that a surplus food distribution of 5 cents per person, and then nearly 6 million Americans receiving that, is adequate. You can't tell me anyone who uses beans instead of meat in the United States, and there are 25 million of them, according to Mr. Benson, is well fed or adequately fed. I believe that we should not compare what our figures may be to India or some other country that has serious problems, but to remember that we are the most prosperous country in the world and that these people are not getting adequate food. And they're not getting, in many cases, adequate shelter. And we ought to try to meet the problem. Secondly, Mr. Nixon has continued to state, and he stated it last week, these fantastic figures of what the Democratic budget platform would cost. They're wholly inaccurate. I said last week I believed in a balanced budget. Unless there was severe recession, and after all, the worst unbalanced budget in history was in 1958, $12 billion, larger than in any administration in the history of the United States. So that I believe that on this subject, we can balance the budget unless we have a national emergency or unless we have a severe recession.
Mr. Morgan with a question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator, Saturday on television, you said that you had always thought that Quemoy and Matsu were unwise places to draw our defense line in the Far East. Would you comment further on that and also address to this question, couldn't a pullback from those islands be interpreted as appeasement?
Well, the United States has on occasion attempted, mostly in the middle 50s, to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to pull his troops back to Formosa. I believe strongly in the defense of Formosa. These islands are a few miles, 5 or 6 miles off the coast of Red China within a general harbor area and more than 100 miles from Formosa. We have never said flatly that we will defend Quemoy and Matsu if it's attacked. We say we will defend it if it's part of a general attack on Formosa, but it's extremely difficult to make that judgment. Now, Mr. Herta, in 1958, when he was Under Secretary of State, said they were strategically undefensible. Admiral Spruance and Collins in 1955 said that we should not attempt to defend these islands in their conference in the Far East. General Ridgway has said the same thing. I believe that when you get into a war, if you're going to get into a war for the defense of Formosa, it ought to be on a clearly defined line. One of the problems, I think, at the time of South Korea was the question of whether the United States would defend it if it were attacked. I believe that we should defend Formosa. We should come to its defense. Leave this rather in the air, that we will defend it under some conditions but not under other, I think is a mistake. Secondly, I would not suggest the withdrawal at the point of the communist gun. It is a decision finally that the nationalists should make. And I believe that we should consult with them and attempt to work out a plan by which the line is drawn at the island of Formosa. It leaves 100 miles between the seas. But with General Ridgway, Mr. Herta, General Collins, Admiral Spruance, and many others, I think it's unwise to take the chance of being dragged into a war which may lead to a world war over two islands which are not strategically defensible, which are not, according to their testimony, essential to the defense of Formosa. I think that we should protect our commitment. I believe strongly we should do so in Berlin. I believe strongly we should do so in Formosa. And I believe we should meet our commitments to every country whose security we've guaranteed. But I do not believe that that line, in case of a war, should be drawn on those islands, but instead on the island of Formosa. And as long as they are not essential to the defense of Formosa, it's been my judgment ever since 1954, the time of the Eisenhower Doctrine for the Far East, that our line should be drawn in the sea around the island itself.
Mr. Vice President.
I disagree completely with Senator Kennedy on this point. I remember in the period immediately before the Korean War, South Korea was supposed to be indefensible as well. Generals testified to that. And Secretary Atchison made a very famous speech at the press club early in the year that Korean War started, indicating in effect that South Korea was beyond the defense zone of the United States. I suppose it was hoped when he made that speech that we wouldn't get into a war. But it didn't mean that. We had to go in when they came in. Now, I think as far as Quemoy and Matsu are concerned, that the question is not these two little pieces of real estate. They are unimportant. It isn't the few people who live on them. They are not too important. It's the principle involved. These two islands are in the area of freedom. The nationalists have these two islands. We should not force our nationalist allies to get off of them and give them to the communists. If we do that, we start a chain reaction, because the communists aren't after Quemoy and Matsu. They're after Formosa. In my opinion, this is the same kind of woolly thinking that led to disaster for America in Korea. I'm against it. I would never tolerate it as President of the United States, and I will hope that Senator Kennedy will change his mind if he should be elected.
Gentlemen, we have approximately 4 minutes remaining. May I ask you to make your questions and answers as brief as possible, consistent with clarity. And Mr. Levy has a question for Vice President Nixon.
Vice President, you are urging voters to forget party labels and vote for the man. Senator Kennedy says that in doing this, you are trying to run away from your party on such issues as housing and aid to education by advocating what he calls a Me Too program. Why do you say that party labels are not important?
Because that's the way we elect a president in this country, and it's the way we should. I am a student of history, as is Senator Kennedy, incidentally. And I have found that in the history of this country, we've had many great presidents. Some of them have been Democrats, and some of them have been Republicans. the people some way have always understood that at a particular time, a certain man was the one the country needed. Now, I believe that in an election, when we are trying to determine who should lead the free world, not just America, perhaps, as Senator Kennedy has already indicated, the most important election in our history, it isn't the label that he wears or that I wear that counts. It's what we are. It's our whole lives. It's what we stand for. It's what we believe. And consequently, I don't think it's enough to go before Republican audiences, and I never do, and say, look, vote for me because I'm a Republican. I don't think it's enough for Senator Kennedy to go before the audiences on the Democratic side and say, vote for me because I'm a Democrat. That isn't enough. What's involved here is the question of leadership for the whole free world. Now, that means the best leadership. It may be Republican, it may be Democratic, but the people are the ones that determine it. The people have to make up their minds. And I believe the people, therefore, should be asked to make up their minds, not simply on the basis of vote the way your grandfather did, vote the way your mother did. I think the people should put America first, rather than party first. Now, as far as running away from my party is concerned, Senator Kennedy has said that we have no compassion for the poor, that we are against progress. The enemies of progress is the term that he's used and the like. All that I can say is this. We do have programs in all of these fields, education, housing, defense, that will move America forward. They will move her forward faster, and they will move her more surely than his program. This is what I deeply believe. I'm sure he believes just as deeply that his will move that way. I would suggest, however, that in the interest of fairness, that he could give me the benefit of also believing as he believes.
Senator Kennedy.
Well, let me say I do think that parties are important in that they tell something about the program and something about the man. Abraham Lincoln was a great president of all the people, but he was selected by his party at a key time in history because his party stood for something. The Democratic Party in this century has stood for something. It has stood for progress. It has stood for concern for the people's welfare. It has stood for a strong foreign policy and a strong national defense, and as a result, produced Wilson, President Roosevelt, and President Truman. The Republican Party has produced McKinley and Harding, Coolidge, and Dewey, and Landon. They do stand for something. They stand for a whole different approach to the problems facing this country at home and abroad. That's the importance of party, only if it tells something about the record. And the Republicans in recent years, not only in the last 25 years, but in the last 8 years, have opposed housing, opposed care for the aged, opposed federal aid to education, opposed minimum wage. And I think that record tells something.
Thank you, gentlemen. Neither the questions from the reporters nor the answers you heard from Senator John Kennedy or Vice President Richard Nixon were rehearsed. By agreement, neither candidate made an opening statement or a closing summation. They further agreed that the clock alone would decide who would speak last, and each has asked me to express his thanks to the networks and their affiliated stations. Another program similar to this one will be presented Thursday, October 13th, and the final program will be presented Friday, October 21st. We hope this series of radio and television programs will help you toward a fuller understanding of the issues facing our country today, and that on Election Day, November 8th, you will vote for the candidate of your choice. This is Frank McGee. Good night from Washington. This is Frank McGee, NBC News in Washington. This is the second in a series of programs unmatched in history. Never have so many people seen